There is a moment in every strategic trap when the door closes, not with a dramatic sound, not with a sudden and obvious shift that announces itself clearly to the people inside it. The door closes quietly, incrementally, through a series of decisions that each seemed reasonable at the time, through a sequence of moves that each appeared to serve immediate interests, through a logic of escalation that felt like strength in every individual step and reveals itself as entrapment only when the full picture becomes visible. Israel is at that moment right now. The trap has been closing for longer than most analysts are willing to acknowledge. And the most difficult truth of this analysis, the one that makes it genuinely important rather than merely provocative, is that the strategic architecture of Israel's current situation has been constructed not primarily by its enemies, though its enemies have contributed to it deliberately and skillfully, but by the accumulated logic of decisions that Israel made from positions of genuine military strength, operating under a strategic framework that was optimized for a threat environment that no longer exists in the form that framework was designed to address. Before we go any further, if this kind of honest, structural, uncomfortable strategic analysis is what you have been looking for, hit that like button and subscribe right now, because telling the truth about what the evidence actually shows, regardless of how convenient or inconvenient that truth is the only standard this channel holds itself to. In this video, we are going to answer 3 questions. What is the trap? Specifically, structurally, and with the precision required to distinguish it from the tactical difficulties that Israeli military and political commentary tends to focus on. How did Israel walk into it? What was the sequence of decisions, the strategic logic, and the environmental shifts that produced the current situation from a starting point of genuine and remarkable strategic strength? And what does it mean that it is already too late? Not as a counsel of despair, but as an honest assessment of which options have closed, which remain open, and what the realistic range of outcomes looks like from inside a strategic trap whose door has already swung shut. Let's build this argument carefully, because it is serious and it deserves the rigor that serious arguments require. The headline version of Israel's strategic situation is a story of military success shadowed by political difficulty. Israel defeated Hamas's conventional military capacity in Gaza. Israel inflicted significant damage on Hezbollah's command structure and missile infrastructure in Lebanon. Israel conducted strikes deep inside Iranian territory that demonstrated a power projection capability its adversaries had not fully credited. Israel's Iron Dome and layered air defense systems performed at levels that impressed military analysts globally. By almost every conventional military metric, Israel has performed with the kind of effectiveness that its defense establishment was designed to deliver. And yet, and this is the central tension that the headline version cannot adequately explain, Israel's strategic position at the end of this sequence of military successes is more precarious, more isolated, and more structurally exposed than at any point in its post-1973 history. Military success has not produced strategic security. That gap between military effectiveness and strategic security is the trap. And understanding why that gap exists, why it persists despite every military achievement, and why it is widening rather than narrowing is the analytical work this video is built to do. The prior context requires going back further than most current analysis does. Back to the strategic environment that Israel's current doctrine, its alliance relationships, and its domestic political consensus were built to address. For the first 4 decades of its existence, Israel faced a specific and in many ways simpler strategic challenge. Conventional military threats from neighboring Arab states with defined armies, defined territory, and defined political leaderships that could be deterred, defeated in conventional battle, and eventually brought to negotiated arrangements. The 1948 war, the 1967 war, the 1973 war, and the subsequent peace agreements with Egypt and Jordan all operated within this framework. Israeli strategy, the doctrine of decisive conventional military superiority, the maintenance of qualitative military edge, the deterrence through demonstrated willingness to escalate to decisive force, was designed for this framework and was extraordinarily effective within it. The peace agreements that framework produced, the Egyptian peace, the Jordanian peace, and the possibility that was visible for a period of a broader regional normalization, represented the strategic dividend of military effectiveness translated into political outcomes through a framework that both sides understood. What happened over the subsequent 3 decades and accelerated dramatically after 2006 is that the primary strategic threat to Israel shifted from the conventional military framework to something the existing doctrine was not designed to address: the non-state military actor. Hezbollah in its post-2000 configuration, Hamas in its post-2007 configuration, and the broader Iranian proxy network in its post-2012 regional expansion, does not present the kind of target against which Israeli conventional military superiority produces the political outcomes that the doctrine promises. You can defeat Hezbollah in the field repeatedly. It reconstitutes. You can destroy Hamas's military infrastructure in Gaza comprehensively. The organizational and political movement that Hamas represents is not destroyed by destroying its military infrastructure. You can strike Iranian-linked assets in Syria with remarkable precision and regularity. The network of relationships, the flow of weapons and resources, and the strategic logic that makes those assets strategically significant is not disrupted by destroying the physical manifestations of it. The doctrine is producing military results. The military results are not producing the strategic outcomes the doctrine promised they would. That disconnect is not a failure of execution, it is a failure of framework. And Israel has been applying the failing framework with increasing intensity for 2 decades without producing the strategic security that the framework's logic requires. Now let's run the actor breakdown, because the trap Israel is walking into was not assembled accidentally. It was constructed deliberately and skillfully by actors with specific objectives, specific tools, and a specific understanding of the framework failure we have just described. Iran is the primary architect of the trap, and the sophistication of its construction deserves genuine analytical respect. Iran identified, probably in the aftermath of the 2006 Lebanon War, the specific structural vulnerability in Israeli strategy that the trap is designed to exploit. That vulnerability is this: Israel's strategic security depends on translating military superiority into political outcomes, deterrence, negotiated arrangements, regional normalization, on a timeline that is compatible with the domestic political consensus and the international legitimacy that Israeli military operations require to sustain. Iran's strategy is designed specifically to prevent that translation from occurring by maintaining the proxy network at a level of capability that forces Israel into repeated military operations. Iran ensures that Israeli military resources are continuously consumed, Israeli domestic political attention is continuously absorbed, and Israeli international legitimacy is continuously eroded without Iran ever having to fight Israel directly. Every Israeli military operation against Hezbollah, against Hamas, against Iranian-linked assets in Syria is an operation that costs Israel in munitions, in international standing, in domestic political consensus, and in the normalization momentum that was supposed to provide the new strategic architecture. And every one of those costs is a contribution to the strategic trap that Iran has been constructing with patient, deliberate investment for 2 decades. Hezbollah's role in the trap is the most operationally significant and the most directly felt by Israeli citizens and military planners. Hezbollah has spent 2 decades doing something that no other non-state actor in the world has accomplished at comparable scale: building a military force that combines the political embeddedness and reconstitution resilience of an insurgency with the missile and rocket capability of a medium-sized state military. The 150,000 plus rocket and missile arsenal that Hezbollah accumulated before the recent conflict was not built for a single use in a single conflict. It was built as a permanent feature of the strategic landscape, a continuous deterrent that forces Israel to maintain a military posture, a resource allocation, and a political focus on the northern border that would otherwise be available for the diplomatic and economic development that strategic normalization requires. That arsenal has been significantly degraded in recent operations, but the organizational capacity and the political relationships that built it are intact. And the resupply logic, the Iranian commitment to rebuilding it as a strategic priority, means that the degradation is temporary in a way that the strategic function it serves is not. The trap is not the arsenal. The trap is the permanent necessity of managing the threat it represents. Hamas's role in the trap is different from Hezbollah's, but equally deliberate in its strategic function. Hamas has never had the military capability to threaten Israel's existence. What Hamas has is the political capacity to make the governance of Gaza, and by extension, the resolution of the Palestinian political question, impossible without Hamas's participation. And Hamas's participation in any governance arrangement that Israel can accept is, given the irreconcilable differences between Hamas's political objectives and Israel's security requirements, structurally unavailable. available. This impossibility is the trap within the trap. Israel cannot destroy Hamas as a political movement through military operations. It cannot govern Gaza without producing the kind of occupation costs that its domestic politics and international relationships cannot sustain. It cannot withdraw from Gaza without creating the conditions for Hamas to reconstitute its military capacity. And it cannot reach a political arrangement that addresses the Palestinian question without engaging with a political reality that includes Hamas in ways that Israeli domestic politics have defined as unacceptable. Every option in the Gaza decision tree leads to a continuation of the trap rather than an exit from it. That is not an accident. It is the designed outcome of the strategic framework that Hamas and its Iranian patron have been constructing. The Palestinian Authority's weakness is the fourth element of the trap, and it is one that receives insufficient analytical attention. The two-state solution framework, the diplomatic architecture that was supposed to provide Israel with a path to trading territorial concessions for genuine political security, requires a Palestinian partner with the political authority, the institutional capacity, and the popular legitimacy to make and implement agreements. The Palestinian Authority, in its current condition, possesses none of these things in sufficient measure. Its authority in the West Bank is contested. Its institutional capacity has been hollowed by decades of underfunding and political dysfunction. Its popular legitimacy, particularly among younger Palestinians, has been severely damaged by the perception of collaboration with Israeli occupation administration and by its inability to deliver either statehood or improved living conditions. The weakness of the Palestinian Authority is not a natural condition. It has been shaped by Israeli settlement expansion in the West Bank, which has progressively reduced the territorial contiguity that a viable Palestinian state requires and has communicated to Palestinian populations that the two-state framework is not a genuine Israeli strategic objective. The result is a diplomatic trap within the military trap. The partner required for the political solution that Israeli strategic security ultimately depends upon has been so weakened by the dynamics of the conflict that it cannot function as that partner, even if the political will for the solution existed, which in the current Israeli domestic political environment, it does not. The United States is the fifth actor in the trap analysis, and its role is the most painful for American and Israeli strategic thinkers to acknowledge honestly. American support for Israel, the weapons, the diplomatic protection at the UN Security Council, the intelligence sharing, the formal and informal security guarantees has been the foundation of Israeli strategic security for 5 decades. That support has been genuine, consistent, and of incalculable value to Israeli military capability and political survivability. But it has also, in ways that were not intended and are not fully acknowledged, contributed to the architecture of the trap. American support has provided Israeli governments with the military capability and the diplomatic protection to pursue policies. Settlement expansion in the West Bank, the management of Gaza through a combination of blockade and periodic military operations, the resistance to Palestinian state building that have progressively reduced the options available for the political resolution that Israeli strategic security ultimately requires. When a powerful patron provides unconditional support that insulates a client from the consequences of strategic choices that are reducing the client's long-term security options, the patron is not serving the client's long-term interests even when it believes it is. That is the uncomfortable structural truth about American support for Israel as it has operated over the last 2 decades. And it is one of the mechanisms through which the trap has been constructed from within the alliance relationship rather than only from without. Now let's go to the structural facts, the hard realities that define the dimensions of the trap and the realistic range of exits from it. Structural fact number 1 is the demographic and territorial arithmetic that makes the current trajectory unsustainable on any honest long-term assessment. The settlement expansion in the West Bank has now reached a scale with over 700,000 Israeli settlers in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, at which a geographically contiguous Palestinian state that meets the minimum requirements for political viability is no longer achievable without a level of settler removal that no Israeli government has the political capacity to implement, and that the Israeli settler movement has the political power to prevent. This arithmetic is not a political argument. It is a mathematical description of geographic reality. The territory that would be required for a Palestinian state that could function as a genuine political entity with territorial contiguity, with access to water resources, with viable agricultural and economic land, is territory that the settlement enterprise has progressively occupied and integrated into Israeli civic, economic, and security infrastructure. The two-state solution, as a geographic possibility rather than a diplomatic aspiration, is being foreclosed not by a single decision, but by the cumulative effect of thousands of individual settlement decisions. And the foreclosure of the two-state solution is not a strategic gain for Israel. It is the elimination of the only diplomatic framework that has ever offered a path to the kind of political security that military operations cannot provide. Structural fact number 2 is the international legitimacy erosion that has accelerated dramatically since October 2023, and that is changing the structural conditions of Israeli strategic environment in ways that military operations cannot reverse. International legitimacy is not a soft concept. It is a strategic asset with specific and measurable value. It determines the diplomatic protection available at the UN Security Council, the willingness of European and other partners to maintain intelligence and security cooperation, the market access that Israeli high-technology exports depend upon, the academic and cultural relationships that constitute one dimension of Israeli soft power, and the domestic political space available to governments and allied democracies to maintain the level of support for Israel that Israeli strategy depends upon. The erosion of that legitimacy through the images and documented realities of civilian casualties in Gaza, through the expansion of West Bank settler violence that has occurred simultaneously with the Gaza conflict, through the legal proceedings at the International Court of Justice, is real, measurable, and directional. It is not being reversed by military success. In the specific political environment of the current conflict, military success and legitimacy erosion are moving in the same direction simultaneously. That combination, military effectiveness, accompanied by accelerating legitimacy erosion, is one of the defining characteristics of the trap. Structural fact number 3 is the alliance reliability question that is emerging with increasing visibility in the American relationship. The American domestic political consensus on Israel, the bipartisan, institutionally embedded, historically grounded commitment to Israeli security that has been the foundation of the alliance relationship, is under more strain than at any prior point in the post-1967 period. The strain is generational, concentrated in the demographic cohorts that will define American politics over the next 2 decades. It is not limited to any single political party, though its most visible expressions have been associated with the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. And it is being driven not by abstract political ideology, but by the specific images and specific documented realities of the Gaza conflict that have reached American audiences, particularly younger American audiences, with a directness and an immediacy that previous Middle Eastern conflicts did not achieve. The bipartisan American political consensus on Israel is not collapsing, but it is narrowing. And a narrowing consensus on an alliance relationship that depends on that consensus for its political sustainability is a structural warning indicator that Israeli strategic planning needs to take seriously rather than dismiss as temporary political turbulence. Structural fact number 4 is the regional normalization reversal that represents the most significant strategic setback of the post-October 2023 period. The Abraham Accords and the trajectory towards Saudi normalization represented the most promising strategic development for Israel in a generation. The possibility of a regional architecture in which Israeli integration into the Gulf economic and security order provided a new foundation for Israeli strategic security that did not depend on resolving the Palestinian question first. That trajectory has not been destroyed, but it has been set back significantly. The political conditions in Saudi Arabia and the broader Arab world that would allow a government to normalize with Israel while Gaza is in its current condition are not present. The Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia has made the calculation that the domestic and regional political costs of proceeding with normalization under current conditions exceed the strategic benefits of the alignment with Israel and the United States that normalization would represent. When Saudi Arabia decides that the political cost of being associated with Israeli policy is higher than the strategic benefit of the alliance with Israel and America, the strategic architecture of the normalization project is in serious difficulty. That calculation is the most concrete and most consequential expression of the legitimacy erosion we have been describing. Structural fact number 5 is the Gaza governance vacuum that is the most immediate and most practically intractable element of the trap. Israel has, through its military operations in Gaza, effectively eliminated Hamas's ability to govern the territory while simultaneously foreclosing the conditions under which any alternative governance structure can establish the legitimacy and authority required to function. The Palestinian Authority cannot govern Gaza without a political process that gives it legitimacy with the population and a security environment that allows it to operate. Neither of those conditions exists. International actors, the Arab states, the European states, the United Nations, are unwilling to invest in governance structures for Gaza without a political horizon that includes a path to Palestinian statehood. That political horizon is not available from the current Israeli government. The result is a governance vacuum in a territory of 2 million people that creates the conditions for humanitarian catastrophe, for the reconstitution of militant organizations in the absence of alternative political structures, and for the continuing international legitimacy erosion that the vacuum's human consequences generate. The governance vacuum is not a temporary condition to be managed while military operations conclude. It is the structural outcome of a military strategy that was designed to destroy an enemy without a plan for what comes after the destruction. From this full structural analysis, the scenario picture for Israel's strategic situation resolves into 3 paths, with the critical caveat that the door on the most desirable path is in the process of closing. The first path is strategic recalibration before the door fully closes. This path requires a combination of things that the current Israeli domestic political environment makes extraordinarily difficult, but that a different political configuration could make possible. It requires a genuine commitment to a political horizon for Palestinian statehood, not as an immediate outcome, but as a stated and credible strategic objective that changes the diplomatic environment and restores the international legitimacy that the current trajectory is eroding. It requires a halt to settlement expansion that is sufficiently credible and sufficiently enforced to demonstrate that the two-state solution remains a geographic possibility rather than a diplomatic fiction. It requires a governance framework for Gaza that provides the political horizon that international actors need to invest in reconstruction and that creates the conditions for a Palestinian political alternative to Hamas. And it requires an Israeli government that is willing to make these choices in the face of domestic political opposition from constituencies whose short-term political interests are opposed to each of them. The path exists. The political conditions for walking it are not currently present. They could become present through a political realignment within Israel that is not impossible, but is not imminent. The window for this path is not permanently closed, but it is narrowing with each settlement approval, each West Bank incident, each week of the Gaza governance vacuum continuing without a political framework. The second path is continued military management with progressive strategic erosion. This is the path that current Israeli policy most closely resembles, a continuation of the approach that has defined Israeli strategy for the last 2 decades, with periodic military operations that degrade specific threats, maintenance of the status quo in the West Bank and Gaza, resistance to the political concessions that a genuine two-state framework would require, and reliance on American support and military capability to manage the consequences. This path is not immediately catastrophic. It preserves the current Israeli military position, the current American alliance relationship at its current level of reliability, and the current regional normalization trajectory at its current significantly setback state. But it is a path of progressive strategic erosion, of declining international legitimacy, declining normalization prospects, widening American political consensus strain, and the continuing construction of the trap whose dimensions we have been mapping. The military operations that this path requires will continue to be executed with considerable effectiveness. The strategic security those operations are supposed to produce will continue to be structurally unavailable for the reasons we have analyzed. The third path is the strategic trap fully closed, the scenario in which the combination of international legitimacy collapse, American domestic political consensus fracture, Gulf state normalization reversal, and Iranian proxy network reconstitution reaches a level where Israeli strategic isolation becomes the defining feature of its external environment. This path does not require a military defeat. It does not require an American abandonment of Israeli security. It requires the cumulative erosion of the specific conditions, international legitimacy, American political consensus breadth, regional normalization momentum, Palestinian governance viability, that the current Israeli strategic position depends upon to be sustainable. The threshold at which this path becomes the default rather than the warning is not precisely definable in advance, but But the directional indicators we have examined are all pointing toward it. And the pace of movement in that direction has accelerated rather than decelerated over the last 2 years. The impact of Israel's strategic trap on the broader regional and global situation is direct and consequential in ways that extend well beyond Israeli borders. The most immediate regional impact is on the Palestinian population. The 2 million people in Gaza and the 3 million people in the West Bank whose daily lives, whose physical security, whose economic prospects, and whose political futures are the human reality inside the strategic abstraction we have been analyzing. The trap is not only Israel's trap, it is a trap that the Palestinian people are inside as well. Unable to achieve the political self-determination that international law and their own aspirations require, unable to build the institutions and the economic foundations that political viability demands, and caught between an Israeli military and political system that cannot provide the political horizon they need, and a Palestinian political structure that cannot deliver it either. The human cost of the trap, measured in lives, in displacement, in the destruction of physical and institutional infrastructure, in the psychological and developmental toll on a generation of Palestinian children, is the most immediate and most morally urgent dimension of the entire analysis. The regional impact on the normalization architecture extends beyond the Israeli-Palestinian dimension to the broader question of what kind of Middle East emerges from the current period. The Abraham Accords represented a genuine and significant strategic achievement. The possibility that the Middle East could reorganize itself around economic cooperation, security alignment, and pragmatic coexistence in ways that reduce the salience of the Palestinian conflict as the organizing principle of regional politics. The current conflict has demonstrated the limits of that reorganization, that the Palestinian question retains a political salience in Arab public opinion and Arab government calculations that pragmatic alignment with Israel cannot indefinitely override. The regional order that emerges from the current period will be shaped significantly by whether the Israeli-Palestinian dimension of the trap is addressed or continues to fester. The global impact is organized primarily around the American relationship and what the strain on that relationship means for the broader American alliance system. If the American domestic political consensus on Israel narrows to the point where American support becomes a partisan rather than a bipartisan commitment, available from some American administrations and contested by others, the reliability of the alliance relationship as a foundation for Israeli strategic planning is fundamentally altered. An ally whose support is contingent on electoral outcomes in a deeply polarized democracy is a different kind of ally than the consistent, institutionally embedded partner that American support has historically represented. The narrowing of the consensus is not yet at the point of making American support contingent in that way, but the direction of movement is toward that point, and the rate of movement has accelerated. My honest analytical conclusion on the trap and its timing. The trap is real, it is structural, and the door has been closing, not suddenly, but incrementally, through the accumulated weight of decisions whose individual logic was comprehensible and whose collective consequence was the construction of a strategic situation from which the exits are fewer and more demanding than they would have been a decade ago. The phrase, "it is already too late," does not mean that Israel's strategic situation is irreversible in the absolute sense. Strategic situations that appear closed have been opened before by combinations of political courage, changed leadership, and shifted external conditions that were not visible until they materialized. What it means is that the options that were available in 2000 or in 2008 or even in 2015, options that would have required less political cost and produced more strategic security, are no longer on the table in their prior forms. The options that remain require more political courage, more concession, and more acceptance of strategic humility than the options that were available earlier and were not taken. The cost of the delay is real. The question is whether the options that remain are still sufficient, if taken with genuine commitment, to produce a strategic outcome that provides Israel with the durable security that its people deserve and that its military operations, for all their effectiveness, have not been able to deliver. The signal to watch is not any single military or diplomatic event. It is the behavior of the Israeli political system in response to the structural pressures we have identified. Whether the domestic political dynamics produce the kind of leadership realignment that strategic recalibration requires, or whether the current political configuration persists long enough for the remaining options to narrow to the point where the strategic trap becomes genuinely, rather than figuratively, irreversible. That political signal, visible in Israeli elections, in coalition dynamics, in the specific policy decisions of the next government, is the leading indicator that determines everything else in the strategic picture we have been mapping. Don't follow the headline, follow the pattern. If this analysis gave you the most honest and most structurally rigorous assessment of Israel's strategic situation that you have encountered, and that is the only standard this channel holds itself to, please like this video and subscribe, because the work of analytical clarity on the stories that matter most is never finished. And the story we have been tracing across this series is now at exactly the point where analytical clarity has the most value and the most urgency. Headlines end, consequences don't. Stay analytical.